When we think of the guillotine, we imagine the French Revolution, crowds gathering in public squares, the theatrical drop of a blade, justice served swiftly and publicly. But here's what most people don't know. The guillotine didn't disappear after 1799. It continued to operate well into the 20th century through both world wars and even beyond. And during those wars, something unusual happened. The guillotine was modernized, not abandoned, not replaced. Modernized. Engineers studied it. Bureaucrats refined its protocols. The state invested in making it more efficient, more reliable, more predictable. This wasn't about spectacle anymore. This was about administration. So here's the question that drives this video. Why would a modern nation, in the age of industrialized warfare and advanced technology, bother to improve an 18th century execution device? What drove France and Germany to update, standardize, and streamline the guillotine during the most devastating conflicts in human history? The answer reveals something unsettling about how states operate under pressure. It shows how bureaucracy responds to a crisis. And it reminds us that modernization doesn't always mean progress in the moral sense. Sometimes it just means doing something terrible more efficiently. The guillotine's wartime evolution wasn't about cruelty. It was about control. It was about maintaining order when everything else was falling apart. It was about ensuring that even amid chaos, the machinery of state justice continued to function with cold precision. In this video, we'll explore the technical improvements made to the guillotine between 1914 and 1945. We'll examine why those changes were deemed necessary, we'll look at the logic behind them, and we'll understand what this tells us about states during wartime. Because the dark reason behind these modernizations isn't what you'd expect. By the early 20th century, the guillotine was still France's official method of execution. It had survived the Revolution, the Napoleonic era, the Restoration, and the Third Republic. Germany, after unification in 1871, also adopted the device in several states, viewing it as more humane than hanging or beheading by sword. When World War I began in 1914, both nations faced unprecedented strain. Millions of men went to war. Economies shifted to total mobilization. Governments expanded their authority dramatically. And with that expansion came increased prosecutions for desertion, espionage, collaboration, and sedition. France executed dozens during the war years, many for treason or military crimes. Germany did the same. The guillotine became a tool, not just of criminal justice, but of wartime discipline. It sent a message. The state's authority remained absolute, even as the front lines collapsed and society fractured. Between the wars, executions continued. Political instability, economic crisis, and rising extremism led to more trials, more convictions, more sentences. By the time World War II began in 1939, the guillotine was busier than it had been in decades. But now there was a problem. The old devices were deteriorating. Some had been in service for over a century. Parts wore out, wood warped, metal corroded. And when the state needed reliability, these machines sometimes failed. Blades jammed, mechanisms misfired. Executions became prolonged. This wasn't acceptable, not to a modern bureaucratic state. If the guillotine was to remain the instrument of law, it had to function flawlessly. It had to reflect the state's competence and authority. A malfunctioning execution device was more than a technical failure. It was a symbolic one. So engineers were consulted, reports were filed, specifications were drawn up. The guillotine, an artifact of the Enlightenment, was brought into the industrial age, not because anyone wanted to kill more people, but because the state demanded that its tools work perfectly. The most striking modernization wasn't immediately visible. It wasn't the blade, which remained essentially unchanged in design. It wasn't the wooden frame, though some versions were reinforced with metal brackets. The key change was internal, the standardization of the release mechanism. Older guillotines used a variety of trigger systems. Some employed a rope and pulley, others used a lever. Still others relied on a pin that, when removed, allowed the weighted blade to fall. These systems varied by region, by builder, by era. Each machine was, in a sense, unique. This uniqueness created problems. Operators needed training specific to each device. Maintenance required custom parts. If a mechanism failed during a scheduled execution, there was no guarantee a replacement component would fit. The lack of standardization introduced unpredictability into a process that demanded absolute certainty. During the wars, this became intolerable. Executions often occurred in different locations: prisons, military facilities, even temporary sites. Moving guillotines between locations meant operators encountered unfamiliar machines. The risk of error increased, so the modernization focused on creating interchangeable parts, standard measurements, uniform release mechanisms that any trained operator could use without hesitation. Think of it like the difference between handcrafted firearms and mass-produced rifles. The goal was the same: reliability through standardization. Technical drawings from this period show precise specifications: the height of the drop, the weight of the blade, the angle of release, the width of the lunette, the wooden collar that held the condemned person's neck in place. Everything was measured, documented, regulated. This wasn't about making executions faster. The guillotine was already swift. This was about eliminating variables, about ensuring that when the state ordered an execution, it happened exactly as planned, every single time, without complications. The modernized guillotine became a perfect bureaucratic instrument, predictable, measurable, and utterly indifferent. From an engineering perspective, the improvements made sense. The guillotine operates on simple physics, gravity acting on mass. A heavy blade, usually weighing between 40 and 60 kilograms, falls from a height of approximately 2.3 meters. The kinetic energy at impact is sufficient to sever the neck cleanly, but several factors could compromise this efficiency: friction between the blade and the grooves it traveled through, misalignment of the wooden uprights, uneven weight distribution in the blade itself, corrosion of metal components. Any of these could slow the blade's descent or cause it to stick. The modernizations addressed these issues systematically. Metal guides replaced some wooden grooves, reducing friction. Ball bearings were introduced in certain models to ensure smoother motion. The blade itself was reforged to more precise specifications, with better weight distribution. The release mechanism received the most attention. Engineers designed a standardized trigger that could be operated with minimal force and maximum reliability. The system used a spring-loaded pin that, when released, allowed the blade to drop instantly. No rope to fray, no lever to jam, just a simple, foolproof mechanism. Maintenance protocols were also established: regular inspections, mandatory testing with sandbags to simulate the weight and resistance of a human body, documentation of every component's condition. If a part showed wear, it was replaced immediately, not after failure. This level of technical precision wasn't about cruelty. Engineers weren't trying to make executions more painful. They were solving a mechanical problem. The state had determined that certain individuals would be executed. The engineer's job was to ensure that determination was carried out without error. It's the same mindset that improved railways, telegraph systems, and weapon manufacturing during the same period. Total war demanded total efficiency. Every system, even the most grim, was subjected to rational analysis and improvement. The guillotine became a piece of precision machinery. But efficiency wasn't just about mechanics. It was about authority. A malfunctioning execution was a public failure of state power. Even though executions in this period were increasingly conducted privately, behind prison walls, rather than in public squares, word still spread. Guards talked. Officials witnessed. Families knew. If the guillotine failed, if the blade stuck, if multiple attempts were needed, the state appeared incompetent, weak, unable to carry out its most fundamental assertion of power, the right to take life as punishment. During wartime, when governments demanded absolute loyalty and obedience, such failures were intolerable. The state needed to project strength, control, and inevitability. The guillotine, functioning perfectly, reinforced that message. The law would be executed. Resistance was futile. The machinery of justice was as reliable as the machinery of war. There was also a psychological dimension for the executioners themselves. Operating a device that might malfunction created stress. Executioners were state employees, often working for decades. They took professional pride in their work, strange as that sounds. A clean execution reflected well on them. A botched one was a personal failure. The modernizations gave these men confidence. They knew the device would work. They could perform their duties without anxiety about mechanical failure. This reduced hesitation, which in turn reduced the suffering of the condemned, who faced a swift end rather than drawn-out uncertainty. For witnesses, typically officials required to be present by law, the efficiency mattered too. These weren't people who enjoyed watching death. They were bureaucrats doing their jobs. A quick, clean execution allowed them to complete their duty and leave. Complications meant prolonged exposure to something deeply unpleasant. So the modernization served multiple audiences: the state, which needed to project authority, the operators, who needed reliable tools, and even the witnesses, who needed the process to end quickly. There's a persistent myth about the guillotine's wartime use, that it was modernized to execute more people faster, that the improvements were about increasing capacity, turning the device into a mass execution tool for political prisoners and resistance fighters. This is largely false. The guillotine's speed was never the limiting factor. It could perform an execution in seconds, whether it was an 18th century model or a 20th century one. The blade falls at the same rate, regardless of minor mechanical improvements. Gravity doesn't change. The real limitation was always legal and bureaucratic. Each execution required a trial, a conviction, a sentencing, an appeal process, even if abbreviated, and official authorization. These took time. The bottleneck was never the guillotine itself. France executed approximately 1,500 people during World War II, many for resistance activities or collaboration after liberation. Germany executed thousands more, though often by other methods. These numbers, while tragic, weren't limited by guillotine capacity. They were limited by the judicial process, however corrupted it became under occupation and dictatorship. Another myth, that the modernizations made executions more painful or cruel. This contradicts the engineering evidence. The improvements reduced friction and ensured a clean drop. A faster blade, falling more smoothly, would cause less suffering, not more. The truth is less dramatic, but more revealing. The modernization wasn't about killing efficiency in terms of numbers. It was about operational reliability. It was about ensuring that each individual execution happened exactly as the state decreed, without error, without complication, without anything that might suggest the state's machinery was flawed. This matters because it shows us something about how bureaucracies think. The focus wasn't on morality or justice. It wasn't even on increasing deaths. It was on perfecting a process, on eliminating uncertainty, on making a terrible thing work smoothly. That's actually more disturbing than the myths. Not every nation or region modernized their guillotines the same way. France, as the device's birthplace, led the technical improvements. The French model became the standard with its precise specifications and interchangeable parts. This version was used in Paris, in provincial prisons, and even in French colonies. Germany's approach varied by region. After unification, different states maintained some autonomy over execution methods. While some German states adopted guillotines similar to the French model, others developed their own variations. Some incorporated more extensive metal framework. Others experimented with different release mechanisms. Interestingly, Belgium and Sweden, which also used the guillotine in this period, made fewer modifications. Their execution rates were much lower, so the pressure to modernize was less intense. Their devices remained closer to 19th century designs, with occasional repairs, but no systematic overhaul. There were also temporary adaptations during the wars. Mobile units were developed for military use, featuring guillotines that could be partially disassembled and transported. These were simpler, more robust designs, sacrificing some elegance for durability and portability. After World War II, the differences became more pronounced. France continued using the guillotine until 1977, maintaining and occasionally upgrading the device. West Germany abolished capital punishment entirely in 1949, rendering their guillotines obsolete. East Germany kept the death penalty but preferred shooting, abandoning the guillotine almost immediately. The last French guillotine used in an execution in 1977 was a modernized version incorporating all the improvements developed during the war years. It functioned perfectly, as designed. The condemned man was executed without complication, and the device was then retired to a museum, so the modernization's legacy was mixed. In some places, it extended the guillotine's operational life by decades. In others, the device was abandoned regardless of its technical sophistication. The improvements ensured reliability, but they couldn't ensure the guillotine's continued use once societies decided capital punishment itself was unacceptable. One aspect of the modernization that deserves attention is the obsessive documentation. Every execution during this period generated extensive paperwork, forms detailing the condemned person's information, technical reports on the guillotine's condition, witness statements confirming the execution occurred, photographs, in some cases, proving the sentence was carried out. This bureaucratic precision served multiple purposes. It created accountability, at least within the system's own logic. Officials could prove they had followed procedures correctly. It also created a historical record, though one that's deeply uncomfortable to examine. The maintenance logs are particularly revealing. They show regular inspections, usually monthly. Each component was checked. The blade's sharpness was tested. The grooves were measured for wear. The release mechanism was triggered repeatedly to ensure reliability. Oil was applied to moving parts. Everything was documented with bureaucratic thoroughness. This attention to detail wasn't unique to the guillotine. It reflected how modern states approached all their operations during wartime. Everything was measured, recorded, standardized. Whether it was railway schedules, ammunition production, or execution devices, the logic was the same. Eliminate variables, ensure predictability, document everything. There's something chilling about reading these maintenance reports. The language is clinical, technical, completely divorced from what the device actually did. A worn groove is noted for replacement. A slightly bent bracket is flagged for repair. The blade is described as satisfactory or requires resharpening. No mention of the human beings whose lives ended on this machine. This linguistic distancing was common in wartime bureaucracies dealing with death. Whether processing concentration camp records, bombing mission reports, or execution documentation, officials used neutral technical language. It made the work psychologically manageable. It turned horror into administration. The guillotine's modernization documentation exemplifies this perfectly. It shows how rational, organized systems can be applied to irrational, terrible purposes. How improvement and efficiency can serve death as easily as they serve life. So we return to our original question, why modernize the guillotine during the world wars? The answer isn't about bloodlust or sadism, it's about something colder and more systematic. States modernized the guillotine because they needed it to work perfectly. Because in times of crisis, when everything else was chaotic and uncertain, the machinery of justice had to function without error. because a malfunctioning execution device represented not just a technical failure, but a failure of state authority itself. The improvements weren't about killing more people faster. They were about ensuring that each execution happened exactly as ordered, with no complications, no delays, no visible flaws. They were about transforming an 18th century device into a 20th century bureaucratic instrument, predictable, measurable, reliable. This reveals something fundamental about how states operate under pressure. When societies face existential threats, governments don't abandon their core functions. They perfect them. They make them more efficient. They eliminate uncertainty. And they do this with the same rational, systematic approach they apply to everything else. The Guillotine's modernization wasn't an aberration. It was consistent with how these nations approached warfare, industry, and administration. Every system was analyzed, improved, standardized. The fact that this system ended human lives didn't exempt it from the logic of modernization. What's most unsettling isn't the device itself. The guillotine was probably more humane than many execution methods used throughout history. What's unsettling is the bureaucratic rationality applied to it. The maintenance schedules, the technical specifications, the interchangeable parts, the cold efficiency of it all. It reminds us that modernity's tools, technological advancement, and bureaucratic organization are morally neutral. They can serve any purpose. They can be applied to terrible things. With the same precision, they're applied to beneficial ones. The dark reason behind the guillotine's modernization is simply this. Efficiency doesn't distinguish between right and wrong. Thank you for watching this exploration of a difficult historical topic. The guillotine's story during the World Wars isn't widely known, perhaps because it doesn't fit our narratives about either technological progress or wartime atrocity. It's too mundane to be shocking, too systematic to be dismissed as simple cruelty, but that's exactly why it matters. History isn't just about dramatic moments and individual villains. It's also about systems, processes, and the logic behind them. Understanding why states modernize their execution devices helps us understand how bureaucracies function, especially under pressure. The documents, maintenance logs, and technical specifications still exist in archives. They're available to researchers willing to examine them. They tell a story of careful engineering, professional dedication, and complete moral detachment. They show us what happens when efficiency becomes the only value that matters. If this video has made you think about the relationship between technology, bureaucracy, and morality, then it's achieved its purpose. These aren't just historical questions. Modern societies still face decisions about how to apply technical expertise and organizational efficiency. We still wrestle with when process and precision should be questioned rather than perfected. The guillotine itself is gone from use now, preserved in museums, a relic of a different time. But the mindset that modernized it, the belief that any system can be improved regardless of its purpose, that mindset remains. If you found this video informative, please consider liking and subscribing. I explore other overlooked historical details with the same analytical approach. And if you have thoughts about this topic, I'd genuinely like to hear them in the comments. Historical discussions are richer when multiple perspectives engage respectfully. Until next time, remember, understanding how things work doesn't mean approving of them. It just means refusing to look away.